Hello, beautiful friends, and welcome back to Chapter 2 of Flat Stanley, His Original Adventure. Yesterday we got to meet Stanley, and we learned that he became flat because of a bulletin board that had fallen on top of his bed while he was sleeping. He went to the doctor, doesn't seem to be bothering him too much. They're just going to keep an eye on him, but remember, he's been shrunk down to 4 feet tall, but just about a half an inch thick. So he's really, really, really thin. So we've got Flat Stanley heading out into the world, and people are just going to keep an eye on him. So here we are in Chapter 2 called Being Flat. When Stanley got used to being flat, he enjoyed it. He could go in and out of rooms even when the door was closed, just by lying down and sliding through the crack at the bottom. I'm picturing that in my head. You can see in our illustration down there how he does that. Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop said it was silly, but they were quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous and tried to slide under a door, but he just banged his head. Being flat could also be helpful, Stanley found. He was taking a walk with Mrs. Lambchop one afternoon when her favorite ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the sidewalk and down between the bars of a grating that covered a deep, dark shaft. Mrs. Lambchop began to cry. "I have an idea," Stanley said. He took the laces out of his shoes and an extra pair out of his pocket and tied them all together to make one long lace. Then he tied one end of that to the back of his belt and gave the other end to his mother. "Lower me," he said, "and I will look for the ring." So you can see it's really a sewer grate kind of in the middle of the sidewalk that he is heading down in to hopefully retrieve that ring. "Thank you, Stanley," Mrs. Lambchop said. She lowered him between the bars and moved him carefully up and down and from side to side so that he could search the whole floor of the shaft. 2 policemen came by and stared at Mrs. Lambchop as she stood holding the long lace that ran down through the grating. She pretended not to notice them. "What's the matter, lady?" the first policeman asked. "Is your yo-yo stuck?" "I am not playing with a yo-yo," Mrs. Lambchop said sharply. "My son is at the other end of this lace, if you must know." "Get the net, Harry," said the second policeman. "We have caught a cuckoo." Just then, down in the shaft, Stanley cried out, "Hooray!" Mrs. Lambchop pulled him up and saw that he had the ring. "Good for you, Stanley," she said. Then she turned angrily to the policeman. "A cuckoo indeed," she said. "Shame." The policeman apologized. "We didn't get it, lady," they said. "We have been hasty. We see that now." So they're kind of apologizing to her because they used the word hasty. Kind of means that they rushed to judgment and they thought she was, it's not really the nicest thing to call someone a little bit of a cuckoo because it kind of means not quite right in the head, not thinking straight. So they weren't very kind in the word that they used to her. So they are now apologizing for judging her too quickly. "People should think twice before making rude remarks," said Mrs. Lambchop, "and then not make them at all." The policeman realized that was a good rule and said they would try to remember it. And there you can see Stanley coming back up. And they don't really show you the faces, but we can tell that that's the 2 policemen and Mrs. Lambchop, sorry. Her name escaped me for a second. Mrs. Lambchop. We're looking at their toes and Stanley coming up out of the ground with the ring in hand. One day, Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had moved recently to California. A school vacation was about to begin, and Stanley was invited to spend it with the Jeffreys. "Oh, boy," Stanley said, "I would love to go." Mrs. Lambchop sighed. "A round-trip train or airplane ticket to California is very expensive," he said. "I will have to think of some cheaper way." When Mr. Lambchop came home from the office that evening, He brought with him an enormous brown paper envelope. Good readers are always making predictions, so if you take a look at that illustration down there, what do you think Mr. Lambchop has in mind? Now then, Stanley, he said, try this for size. The envelope fit Stanley very well. There was even room left over, Mrs. Lambchop discovered, for an egg salad sandwich made with thin bread and a toothbrush case filled with milk. They had to put a great many stamps on the envelope to pay for both airmail and insurance, but it was still much less expensive than a train or airplane ticket to California. So they're gonna mail Stanley in an envelope in order to save some money. But don't worry, they got insurance. That means they don't want it to get lost, so you pay a little bit extra to make sure that your item is really cared for appropriately. And their item is Stanley, so we really want to make sure that he's taken care of. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop slid Stanley into his envelope along with the egg salad sandwich and the toothbrush case full of milk and mailed him from the box on the corner. The envelope had to be folded to fit through the slot, but Stanley was a limber boy, and inside the box he straightened right up again. Limber means very easily bent. If you're very flexible, you could use the word limber to describe yourself. So he folded himself up so that if you've ever seen the mailbox, it's kind of a small rectangle. He folded himself up to get through that hole, and then once he was down inside, he could stretch himself out again. Mrs. Lambchop was nervous because Stanley had never been away from home alone before. She rapped on the box. "Can you hear me, dear?" she called. "Are you all right?" Stanley's voice came quite clearly. "I'm fine. Can I eat my sandwich now?" "Wait an hour and try not to get overheated, dear," Mrs. Lambchop said. And then she and Mr. Lambchop cried out, "Goodbye, goodbye," and went home. Stanley had a fine time in California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys returned him in a beautiful white envelope they had made themselves. It had red and blue markings to show that it was airmail, and Thomas Jeffrey had lettered it "valuable" and "fragile" and "this end up" on both sides. Those words valuable and fragile, those are words that might not be familiar for you. Valuable means it's something, sometimes it does cost a lot of money, but other times just something that's really important to you. We could use the word valuable. So your family would be considered valuable, but a ring like Mrs. Lambchop lost, that might also be considered valuable. Fragile means easily broken, so we use the word fragile for things that are glass or crystal or something like that. It means it could be easily broken, and we certainly don't want poor Stanley to get broken. So back home, Stanley told his family that he had been handled so carefully he never felt a single bump. Mr. Lambchop said it proved that jet planes were wonderful, and so was the Postal Service, and that this was a great age in which to live. Stanley thought so too. So here we are, the end of chapter 2. So far, we only have some positive things about his being flat experience. He got to travel to California, very far away, in a very expensive plane trip, but he didn't quite go the traditional way. So a little bit of a fun experience. So right now, Stanley is on his very first adventure. When we can, based on how our book looks, we can kind of sneak a peek at chapter 3, which is called Stanley the Kite. Again, go ahead, make some predictions. What kind of adventure do you think Stanley will get into this time? But until tomorrow, I will save chapter 3 for then. Bye, friends.